what would you expect? You would expect all the mercury to fall out. No, it does not. It falls to a certain level, and notice the shape of the meniscus, the shape of the surface. It falls how far? So that this length is about 76 centimeters, or about 30 inches. And that is one atmosphere which sustains this column of mercury. And here is a region highly, highly empty of everything, except a little mercury vapor, perhaps. So one of the best vacuums we can get is produced by such a performance of a mercury column in a glass tube. Now let's see what else we could show. What else could we? Look at this. Isn't this fantastic? Indeed. Oh, I have another one. I have another one, and since it enchants me, I'm going to do it. This was boiling over there. Here it is. Notice. I'm in a hurry. Listen. There it goes. Notice, I thought I had not boiled the water long enough, because if there was any occluded air in there, we would have trouble. And so, are you not agreed that atmospheric pressure is a staggering thing to witness? And I thank you for listening.
This is so incredibly ridiculous because nowhere in reality can you demonstrate a vacuum existing adjacent to some body of gas without a sturdy structure separating the two. Now, I'm not saying that there's a sturdy structure in the sky. There probably is magnetic fields or even magnetic fusion plasma up there. Probably not a glass dome. But what I'm saying is that space is not an infinite vacuum at all. Without getting any deeper into the weeds here, the bottom line is neither of these arguments can possibly account for the two flights in question having even a similar duration. That's physically impossible unless the two destinations are actually stationary, which indeed they are. If you take the time to study the heliocentric model, there are all sorts of problems with it, least of which is the motion which would need to exist if the model were correct. If you can honestly believe that you wouldn't notice the difference between the Earth racing up towards your feet in the morning and racing away from your feet 12 hours later with the opposite velocities of 66,000 plus miles an hour, that's a change in velocity for you on the ground of over 130,000 miles an hour from day to night in this example. If you actually believe this, you're experiencing cognitive dissonance. Besides what we can see or sense ourselves, what else can we look at to demonstrate the truth and demonstrate that the world is actually a stationary plane, and anyone who continues arguing against this after actually considering the physics involved is a dumbass and a moron? Well, for starters, let's look at the apparently rotating stars, since astronomical observations are the root of the entire theory which places us on a point of a sphere spinning through space and time at the given velocities. What can the stars tell us about the shape and nature of the world, and whether or not the heliocentric model works, if only just in theory? So try to consider the concept of visible space. If the Earth is actually a spinning globe, a couple of basic rules visible space must adhere to are: 1, we cannot observe the stars during the day, and 2, our line of sight towards the horizon would be a tangent to the curve of the Earth. So if standing at the equator looking directly overhead would be a 90-degree angle to the supposed axis of rotation. When you piece all this data together for a basic diagram, you'll clearly see that the stars overhead near the equator during the winter would literally be on the opposite end of the universe as the stars overhead at the same point on Earth during the summer. The heliocentric models argue that the distance to the stars allows us to travel vast distances through space around the sun and through the theoretical universe along with the galactic center without noticing any sort of parallax change in all of history. If we're talking about parallax changing the relative position of relatively close stars more quickly than the relative position of distant stars over time, we simply don't see it. However, the parallax argument is totally irrelevant to this point. Even conceding the stellar distances given by contemporary astronomers, the problem I'm referring to, simply called the Jeranism effect, is actually compounded by incomprehensibly distant theoretical stars. So this problem actually gets worse the further you place the stars. The problem here has nothing to do with the vast distances theoretically involved with the Earth's non-existent lapse around the Sun, but instead has to do with our line of sight towards visible space. Again, if you're near the equator in the winter, look straight up and you should be looking at one sector of the universe. However, 6 months later, looking straight up towards the sky at night from the same point, you'd be looking at a completely opposite side of the universe. The simple fact is, we can see many of the same constellations from season to season, which simply cannot occur in a heliocentric reality, and completely disproves the heliocentric model altogether. There's no getting around it. Taking this argument even further, the moon itself should only be visible during the day for roughly half of each month. Remember, the day side of Earth is a fixed area in space. Whichever side of the Earth happens to be facing towards the sun at that point in time would experience daytime. Since the moon allegedly orbits the non-existing spherical Earth once a month, and is supposedly orbiting the Earth on essentially the same plane which the Earth supposedly orbits the sun, then we should only be able to view the moon during the day for about half of each month. So this simply isn't the case. You just don't see the moon only during the day for half of each month. Sometimes you see the sun 15 days out of each month, or half of each month. For those of you who don't know, Helios is the sun god of ancient mystery and is arguably interchangeable with Baal and ultimately Lucifer, the light bearer. I'm not trying to freak anyone out here, but it appears that the religion of scientism has conspired against us over at least the last 3 generations, possibly for the last several hundred years, in which time they've conscripted an unofficial worldwide religion of sun worshippers who believe everything in our lives is owed directly to the sun instead of an intelligent designer, and therefore people the world over are compelled to subconsciously worship the sun in such a way which makes it psychologically impossible for such an indoctrinated person to sense a connection with the actual creator or intelligent designer. Now, this might sound far-fetched, but ask a scientist where everything comes from. They'll tell you that the tiny particles or atoms which supposedly make up our bodies were once star stuff. And if it weren't for prehistorical stars dying, then we never could have existed, nor could our planet or even our sun. The same scientist will tell you that all life on Earth is dependent on the sun, and that our ancient ancestors were monkeys, and before them lizards, before them fish, and then amoeba, and finally the original human, a pile of inanimate soup. Not only does this violate the fundamental laws of entropy, which dictates that a complex system will always deteriorate over time given to natural forces, but besides that, nowhere can you demonstrate soup becoming alive. Just as you will never see a dog naturally giving birth to anything but a dog, regardless of the breeding variables you might manipulate or to get all sorts of different types of dogs. You're never going to have a dog and cat mate in the natural sense, and you're never going to have a dog give birth to anything but a dog. So how can we possibly have complex genetic code without a coder? Even the most simplest of life forms, single-celled organisms, have DNA. And DNA is essentially different compounds made of amino acids, which are a naturally occurring substance, but you just simply can't have amino acids randomly getting into order and creating DNA out of chance. It just doesn't happen in reality. A similar analogy would be to have a tornado go through a junkyard an infinite number of times. Would the tornado eventually build a working 747? No, it would never happen. But that's really a lot easier. It would be easier for a tornado to randomly create a working 747 than it would be for amino acids to randomly create DNA. DNA is so very complex code. It really sort of proves that there had to have been someone to write that code. How can we have evolution without any physical evidence of cross species, which would eventually be discovered by biologists at many points just accidentally, but instead we never find any evidence of creatures which were the cross between two different creatures or two different species in line with the theory of evolution. Even Charles Darwin admitted that if no such intermediary cross species were ever discovered, decades and decades after the theory of evolution was being tested, then the theory of evolution must be incorrect. And that's even Darwin said that, okay? And plainly, simply, we cannot find evidence for any sort of evolution. Furthermore, there was a prehistoric fish that was thought to be millions of years extinct that was recently rediscovered and is swimming all over the place. At any rate, this should prove that while scientists claim to be so meticulous in terms of facts, or give the impression that science is always correct, however, when you study the tenets of their belief system, not only is it completely incorrect and indeed preposterous, but it requires a level of cognitive dissonance which can only be achieved by tattooing false facts or false beliefs into our psyche from as early on as possible. Even the very intelligent scientific minds of our time appear to be incapable of even considering the notion that the world might actually be a stationary plane, which is unfortunate, but it does prove them to be the opposite of scientific, and instead shows that they are blind followers of the cult of scientism, mindless repeaters. Another sort of important observation I wanted to touch on real quick is the high altitude weather balloon footage, even during the daytime, or always during the daytime. You never see any stars. Now, I always thought this was because of the reflective nature of the atmosphere, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. I mean, maybe it is, but the sunlight, obviously here on the ground, it causes the atmosphere to become totally opaque, even for objects, close to the ground that are far off in the distance. The atmosphere will sort of act like a mirror. I mean, it's what causes mirages. It's refraction, basically. With that being said, what could possibly cause the stars to be invisible when you're above the atmosphere's blueness? So either the sun is causing such interference patterns in the visible spectrum that it's sort of drowning out the light from the stars. So anyway, I'm not sure what's going on with the stars here. Now, the other thing it could be is that visible light is only visible once it passes through certain layers of our atmosphere, but then the sun would probably not be visible. So it seems like the light waves of the sun are causing interference patterns somewhere deep in our magnetosphere or magnetoplane or whatever. Anyway, I'm not so sure anymore that the stars are rendered visible during the daytime because of the atmosphere alone. Obviously, that plays a part in it, but it's just interesting that the dim moonlight can penetrate through the blue reflective atmosphere, and yet the starlight can't. Not to mention the fact that we can see the full moon during the daytime, which is physically impossible in the heliocentric model. There's no way you get that angle in your model. Certainly doesn't help the heliocentric model if the stars are all a bunch of suns. Really, we should be able to see all the stars during the day if that was actually the case, but a bit of a conundrum. Thought it was interesting, and just figured I'd put that out there because it's one of those things that you don't really notice until you're okay. And then you notice real clearly in any high altitude weather balloon footage that you look at that even when you're well above the sort of aura of the atmosphere, and you can see very clear darkness above the ground and above your head, but no stars.
Because if there was any occluded air in there, we would have trouble. And so, are you not agreed that atmospheric pressure is a staggering thing to witness? And I thank you for listening. what would you expect? You would expect all the mercury to fall out. No, it does not. It falls to a certain level, and notice the shape of the meniscus, the shape of the surface. It falls how far? So that this length is about 76 centimeters, or about 30 inches. And that is one atmosphere which sustains this column of mercury. And here is a region highly, highly empty of everything, except a little mercury vapor, perhaps. So one of the best vacuums I'm going to do it. This was boiling over there. Here it is. Notice, I'm in a hurry. Listen. There it goes. Notice I thought I had not boiled the water long enough, and get is produced by such a performance of a mercury column in a glass tube. Now let's see what else we could show. What else could we? Look at this. Isn't this fantastic? Indeed. Oh ho, I have another one. And since it enchants me,